Welcome everyone to Geopol South Asia. Today we will have a special chat with former US State Department official Jon Danilowicz. Jon worked extensively in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and several countries of Africa. Jon was the Consul General of the US Consulate at Peshawar, Pakistan, and the Deputy Head of Mission of the US Embassy in Bangladesh. Jon is currently the editor-at-large of South Asia Perspective, a quarterly print magazine published from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you tonight.
Jon Danilowicz wrote this article for the Dhaka Tribune, one of Bangladesh's largest English-language dailies. The article was about the efficacy of lobbying. The context is as follows. Sajib Wajid Joy, the son of Bangladesh's deposed autocrat Sheikh Hasina, hired a DC-based lobbying firm aligned with the former US President Donald Trump. The news got serious traction in Dhaka's print media and obviously on social media. Jon's article, titled "Does Lobbying Actually Influence Policy?" made the argument that such lobbying is unlikely to be successful for Joy. Jon's suggestion for anyone trying to counter Joy's efforts by hiring another lobbyist firm in Washington, D.C. is that just don't do it. Jon's idea is that Bangladesh is better off hiring the right personnel for the Bangladesh embassy in Washington, D.C., rather than spending money on expensive lobbying efforts. So, Jon, with that context, let's get started on some details about that firm.
In the United States, there's obviously a lot of interest and concern about foreign agents lobbying on behalf of foreign entities. So for this reason, the U.S. Department of Justice requires foreign agents to register. And through the registration process, one can glimpse some insights into the nature of a relationship between a lobbying firm and their client. In this case, it seems at first glance that it's fairly straightforward, that the client, the Wajid Joy, has hired this firm. As you mentioned, the firm notably includes principals who worked with former President Trump and who have represented a number of other foreign governments.
Okay, so it's $200,000 for 6 months of work. That does not sound like a lot. What do you think?
Again, the details between the client and the lobbying firm are contained within the disclosure. My understanding, though, is that the $200,000 is more of a retainer. And then the lobbying firm will conduct activities on behalf of their client and will bill the client for those activities at a prior arranged or agreed upon rate.
So back in the 1990s, there was this other lobbying firm that we know of. They were working for getting the GSP facilities for Bangladesh. And then we also know during your tenure, US Embassy in Dhaka, there were instances where the Hasina regime, they did hire another lobbying firm or maybe a PR firm at that time. Do you have any recollection of those efforts, how those panned out back then?
Sure. As a number of entities from Bangladesh, both private individuals, business associations, and the government of Bangladesh have hired lobbyists over time. Lobbying is a business after all. And the businesses, the lobbyists, have a service that they provide to their clients, and they market those services. This has been done for a number of years. It's happened again, in Bangladesh, as you mentioned, in pursuit of trade preferences. It's been pursued during a government tenure to justify or to gain support for the government's actions. It's been used by opposition politicians to advance their causes. And again, it's been used by private individuals.
And one instance I think you cited in your article, that was about the extradition, the attempted extradition of one of the killers of Sheikh Mujib, who resides in the United States. And I think you mentioned that that effort did not come to fruition.
So again, I think you need to separate the activities from the outcomes. And then obviously the challenge is to draw the connection between the actions and the outcome. then you have to ask whether that outcome was achieved. In my experience, I can't really point to a case in which the lobbyist activities directly led to an outcome that their client was pursuing. The lobbyists in the cases that you mentioned were able to secure meetings with U.S. government officials to provide the client the opportunity to put forward their case. They were able to maintain communication with elements within the United States government, both the executive and the judicial branch, or the legislative branch, to help advance the client's interest. But again, at the end of the day, did they achieve the outcomes that they promised? In the experiences that I'm familiar with, the answer to that is no.
You just mentioned that lobbyists gain access to politicians and maybe some commissions and committees, think tanks, or maybe they just help politicians get some nice little pictures that they can post on social media. The former Sheikh Hasina government was famous for that. In a nutshell, what do you think lobbyists offer besides just access? Do they get some articles published, some research pieces published, or maybe some positive PR in a news media? Do they do those kind of stuff, or that's for PR firms?
I think lobbyists can do all of the things that you mentioned. And my purpose is not to denigrate the profession of lobbying or to pick on the specific lobbying firms that have been hired in these instances. For me, really, it's a question about effectiveness. For me, the focus of the article and the focus of my thinking was more on how the interim government should respond, because I anticipated that the initial response to this would be that the government needs to fight fire with fire, that if the former prime minister's son hired a lobbyist to advance his and her cause in Washington, then the response of the interim government should be to hire their own lobbying firm to counter that. And I'm relatively certain that lobbying firms in Washington are probably marketing their services as we speak to the government of Bangladesh to try to make the argument that they need to have a lobbyist engaged by the government. From my perspective, based on my experience, I don't think that this is necessary, nor do I think that this is the best way for the government of Bangladesh to use its limited resources.
All right, so we talked about the efficacy of lobbying, and you made the case that for Bangladesh's case, it may not actually work. But I did find some examples where lobbying actually yielded some of the desired outcome that the sponsors were trying to achieve. For example, Saudi Arabia spent a lot of lobbyist efforts on Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, back in 2016. The background was that US Congress was about to pass JASTA, a law that allows American citizens to sue foreign governments, including Saudi Arabia, for alleged involvement in terrorist activities. So Saudi Arabia started funding billions of dollars of lobbying efforts to convince Congress that passing JASTA would be detrimental for the US-Saudi relationship. JASTA did pass the US Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, and it overcame a US presidential veto. However, Saudi lobbying efforts was successful in mitigating some of the challenges for Saudi Arabia that came through JASTA. Indians lobbied the United States government back in 2005-2008 for the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. As a non-signatory to the NPT agreement, India was not supposed to get US assistance for its civilian nuclear research and nuclear activities. However, through a multi-pronged lobbying efforts with the US government, think tanks, and various other avenues, India was successful in establishing strong nuclear cooperation with the United States, and the US Congress passed the Hyde Act, which allowed civilian nuclear trade with India, making a significant shift in US nuclear policy towards a non-NPT state. Right after 9/11, Pakistan spent millions of dollars doing lobbying to keep its status as an ally of the US war on terror. As an outcome of that lobbying effort, Pakistan secured billions of dollars of military and economic aid over the next decade. the lobbyist efforts led to sustained financial and military assistance for years. So these are some of the examples from South Asia, and then there are some other examples from Qatar and UAE, where those governments spent billions of dollars in US think tanks and lobbyist firms to keep the US close to them. Now, that brings us to the question, if lobbying did work for these countries like India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, why do we think that lobbying is not going to work for Sajid Wajid Joy regarding his case, which is basically to reinstitute a deposed dictator, which is his mother, Sheikh Hasina? Why do you think lobbying for that cause is not going to be effective? Is that because the cause is not worth fighting for?
I think obviously you have to look at each case independently. And you've cited a number of cases, and I'm sure each one of these would merit a much deeper dive into what the actual dynamics were. I think if you start, you have to look at the complicated nature of U.S. foreign policy decision making. Obviously, the executive branch has the lead on foreign policy, the president, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, other members of the National Security Council. Congress is also an important player in foreign policy, and then the private sector, non-governmental organizations. So there are many inputs into policy. Lobbyists obviously seek to influence the policymaking process, and since they can't be everywhere, they choose selectively where they think they can have the greatest influence. So part of what they're doing is they're providing that strategic advice. And as we've discussed previously, it may be the case that is a value that the lobbyist provides that the client doesn't otherwise have, is understanding the process and understanding where the pressure points are. In terms of the executive branch, in my experience, that's probably where lobbying is the least effective. In a case like you've mentioned with Bangladesh, the executive branch, through the State Department, the South Central Asia Bureau, through our embassy in Dhaka, my sense is that the State Department has a pretty good understanding of what's happening in Bangladesh, so that officials at the State Department, the National Security Council, the White House, don't need a lobbyist to tell them what's happening. It may be that a member of Congress or staff may be susceptible to influence from a lobbyist who provides them information. That said, these members of Congress are receiving information from a variety of sources. And one factor that has emerged in recent years, and was particularly evident this past summer, was the important role played by the Bangladeshi diaspora in the United States. We saw a probably unprecedented amount of activism by the Congress during this period. And I think the greatest credit for that goes to the Bangladeshi American community, which mobilized to reach out to their respective members of Congress and staff to inform them about what was happening in Bangladesh and to urge the Congress to take action. So to answer your specific question, I think it's difficult to see what the recently signed lobbying agreement is meant to accomplish.
All right. So now let's talk about your specific proposal. In that article, you made the case that Bangladesh needs to make the Bangladesh embassy stronger by recruiting and posting competent officials, and that's going to be the best bang for the buck for Bangladesh. Now, my question is, how realistic is that, particularly with government officials in Bangladesh? They are known as BCS cadres. With those folks, they are not oriented about the US ways of communication, US styles of writing, American signaling mechanisms, body language. All of these soft skills matter when you are trying to influence policy and you are trying to go to the powerful quarters of Washington, D.C. to influence them. How likely do you think Bangladesh is going to find these type of officials from Bangladesh? Or are you suggesting that the Bangladesh embassy should be recruiting people who are already here, like academics or journalists who know the American way? What's your suggestion there?
So I've been associated, or I was associated with Bangladesh through my 32-year career. My first posting was in Dhaka in 1990, and then I served in Dhaka from 2012 to 2014. So I was fortunate to know scores of Bangladeshi diplomats, including many who served in Washington. Now, along with other parts of the civil service in Bangladesh, over the years, there certainly was a detrimental effect of the politicization and the overall decline in the quality of the civil service. And that also manifested itself to some extent within the foreign service. But I'm confident that there are still many capable individuals within Bangladesh's foreign service who could be posted to Washington and be very effective. And I think that for a Bangladeshi diplomat, Washington can and should be a very permissive environment. There are many friends of Bangladesh. Hopefully, with the change that took place this summer and with the interim government in place, Bangladesh can start to rebuild some of those relationships. But Bangladesh already has natural allies. They have natural allies within the executive branch. They have natural allies within the Congress and staff. I think that a Bangladeshi diplomat doesn't have to jump over, is trying to gain a positive impression of the country. I think that positive impression already exists. When I look at the options of investing money in lobbying contracts or investing money in strengthening the embassy, I see it very much in this way, as an investment, as a choice. It seems to me that even the figures that we've talked about before, $200,000 for 6 months work, I would much rather see the Bangladesh government invest $200,000 in the work of its embassy than give that money to a lobbyist to arrange some meetings, send some emails, arrange photo ops, as you said. Beginning now, I would argue that Bangladesh needs to adjust the way it thinks about the role of its diplomats overseas and provide them the resources and training that they need to be effective in this role. The first thing that Bangladesh needs to do is to get an ambassador in Washington appointed ASAP, and that, in my view, this should not be necessarily just another career diplomat. I think the present moment calls for a different type of representative who can speak to the historic changes happening in Bangladesh.
I also feel the same way. I do not think it is possible in a challenging environment to penetrate Washington, D.C. For a newly arrived Bangladeshi official, particularly if we have established players with Bangladeshi passports in the U.S. who know the U.S. system. I would rather have some of them appointed as the Bangladeshi ambassador. But that's a discussion for a different day.
Yeah. And the tricky thing, obviously, is that there have been Bangladeshi ambassadors in Washington who have also been U.S. citizens, but then this becomes complicated for them because they don't have privileges and immunities. But certainly the next ambassador has to leverage the Bangladeshi diaspora in the U.S. and leverage the expertise that exists elsewhere. And hopefully one of the advantages a new Bangladeshi ambassador will have that ambassadors haven't had over the last 15 years is they don't have Joy looking over their shoulder and worried that whenever they say something, either Joy or the Bangladesh Awami League in the U.S. is going to report back on them and they're going to lose their job.
All right, so we're almost about to wrap up here. I have one last question for you. That question is, how likely is it for the United States to change its approach towards Bangladesh dramatically if there is a change of power in Washington, D.C., like if the Republicans ascend to the presidency? Do you envision a dramatic shift in American approach towards Bangladesh or American understanding of Bangladesh?
Certainly, there could be a shift. And I think this is something that the interim government will need to think about and will need to be prepared to respond to. First of all, most of the individuals who work on policy related to Bangladesh won't change as a result of the election, particularly those in the executive branch. Those career individuals at our embassy in Dhaka, at the State Department working on Bangladesh issues, and at other agencies will likely not change. Certainly, senior officials will change at the Assistant Secretary of State level and above, and some positions below. So there will be some changes, and the new administration will have to come up with its kind of priorities. There may be changes in Congress as well. The control of the Senate and the House will determine who heads the relevant committees and what those assignments are. Overall control of one or more House might change, because the margins are so close. Yet the individuals who are assigned to the key committees will likely not change, and along with them, their staff will likely not change. I think for the government of Bangladesh, regardless of what happens on election day, many of the key people that they'll need to be interacting with won't change. Now, that's not to say that the administration itself, the new administration, whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration, may not take a different approach. The good news for Bangladesh is that there will be some time for them to craft their strategy. While the new administration will be inaugurated in January, experience shows that it'll be some number of months before the new team is fully in place. There are many pressing foreign policy issues that the new administration will have to deal with, and it's likely that Bangladesh policy won't be in the first tier of issues that the new administration thinks about. So there's some time. And I think particularly if former President Trump is reelected, the government of Bangladesh will need to think about how to package its approach to the United States a bit differently. By all accounts, a second Trump administration would have an America first focus on its foreign policy. So the argument in favor of relations between the U.S. and Bangladesh would need to be couched in those terms. The government of Bangladesh would need to help make the case for how close relations with Bangladesh, how support for the interim government's reform agenda serves America's interests. I think that argument can be made, but it's a slightly different way of framing the argument than would be necessary if it were a Democratic administration.
All right, Jon, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks a lot for your time. Hope to see you back again.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking with you as well.